Sometimes the local funeral homes would call me to oversee a funeral if the family didn't have a church that still wanted a minister to officiate. And in this particular case, the deceased, a woman named Phyllis, had no church affiliation, and neither did her family. I spoke with her son and her daughter-in-law so I could have some idea of what she was like so I could put together a eulogy. I'm never comfortable doing just a sermon at those sorts of funerals without saying something personal about the departed. And her death had not been unexpected, and the family wanted the service to be simple, but uplifting and happy, not sad. They wanted it to be a celebration of her life. She wasn't religious, they told me. She liked spending time with her grandkids. She liked camping. Not a whole lot I could hang a eulogy on, but I figured I'd make it work. And then they told me, toward the end of the conversation, oh, by the way, she was a big, huge, giant Kenny Rogers fan. And I thought, okay, I can work with that. So fast forward a few days to the funeral, and it's a beautiful June afternoon. The sun is out, it's pleasantly warm, a nice breeze. And the funeral director and I drove in his car into the cemetery, and we pull up to where Phyllis's family has assembled. And it's a pretty big group, like about maybe 20 people or so. And I'm excited to see this because it's going to make what I've planned so much more successful. So I move over to stand beside Phyllis's grave, and the family assembles around me in sort of a half circle. And I start my eulogy. And I read the 23rd Psalm. I read the time to be born, time to die, passage from Ecclesiastes. And I say a few other things about death and grief. And then I move into talking about Phyllis. And I mention how much Phyllis enjoyed spending time with her family, how much she liked camping. And as I'm finishing up, I say, to wrap up here this morning, I'd like to share a few lines from Phyllis's favorite modern philosopher, whose legacy includes these immortal words: you've got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them. And at this point, I broke into song, expecting those gathered to sing along with me. They did not. So I finished the song, there'll be time enough counting when the deal's done. And they all just stared at me. Okay, I thought, okay, they just didn't expect me to do that. They weren't ready. So I said, loudly and enthusiastically, one more time, everybody. One more time for Phyllis. And I started singing. You've got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them. And nobody sang. So I stood there next to Phyllis's grave singing The Gambler at the top of my lungs by myself twice. Keep twice, that's right. The kindly and sympathetic funeral director laughed all the way back to the car. See, my plan would have been a good one if everyone had cooperated. If I had started singing and everyone else had joined in, the song would have grown from a sad, struggling solo to a full-voiced musical tribute to Phyllis's life and her favorite singer. But instead of growing, the song fizzled out. It's the same sort of thing that happens, sad to say, in so many of our churches. They start out with great intentions, but eventually they fizzle out and have no choice but to close their doors. And the reasons that churches end up closing are, of course, not the same from church to church, and some survive longer than others. But in the end, what keeps a church alive is its commitment to God, to showing love to the world, and to growing together. In our reading this morning from the book of Acts, we're witness to the creation of the earliest Christian church. Now, the book of Acts, as we know, follows the four Gospels. It's actually the second part of a composite work by Luke. Basically, Luke and Acts are considered one big book. Sometimes they're referred to as Luke Acts. But in the biblical canon, they're separated by the Gospel of John. Now, the reason I point this out is to show how connected the book of Acts is to the Gospels. disciples learning from Jesus and traveling with Jesus and listening to Jesus and being trained by Jesus. And when Jesus is crucified and then resurrected and finally ascended to heaven, the disciples became known as the apostles and set out to continue to spread the gospel of Jesus and establish the first churches. Incidentally, as you may or may not know, disciple means student and apostle actually means messenger. So while the 12 were with Jesus, they were disciples. And after his ascension, they became apostles, tasked with continuing to teach others the gospel of Jesus. Now, the book of Acts, and this passage in particular, is a blessing and a curse to the modern church. It shows that insanely successful church growth can be done. But it also seems impossible when we compare our often struggling congregations with what essentially became a first century megachurch. Now, the gospel writer Luke, who, as I said, wrote both the Gospel of bears his name and the book of Acts, was not a historian or a journalist. Tradition says he was a physician. But the book of Acts is our most comprehensive history of the spiritual and political movement that gave birth to the early Christian church. Beginning with the resurrection of Jesus, Acts chronicles the actions of the church at Jerusalem and the spread of Christianity across Greece and Asia Minor, culminating in the Apostle Paul's very public Christian presence in Rome. Now, I know I often stand up here and remind you that we're the disciples of Jesus now, that we're the apostles now charged with continuing the work of Christ in the world. But today I'm going to ask us to shift our perspective a little, and instead of the apostles, to see ourselves as the group of believers who composed the growing church in the first century. They saw themselves as ministers, all of them. You know what? Grab your Bibles again. Let's look again at this passage from Acts 2. If you're using a Pew Bible, it's on page 1693. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. Keep in mind that these people were largely Jewish. We tend to think of very clear lines and distinctions between Christians and Jews. But what we're seeing here is that beautiful time when people who were lifelong followers of the Jewish tradition now had new beliefs in the divinity of Jesus added to their list. So what we're seeing here is that transitional time when their Jewish practices and their new beliefs were still coalescing into a new way of life. These people are in. They are all in. They are listening with absolute rapt attention, Luke calls it awe, to what the apostles are telling them. And their enthusiasm, their devotion to this new way of life spurs them to get actively involved in the growth of this new church. Verse 45 says they would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. They started mission work, outreach, helping others, all those things that a church does or should be doing today. So do you see what's happening here? The apostles are telling people about Jesus, about what Jesus taught them, about loving and caring for others. And they're so jazzed up that they start selling their stuff and giving the money to those in need. Verse 46 says they spent so much time together in the temple, remember, still Jewish, that they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts. They came together in worship and fellowship, and it nurtured them and nourished their souls so much that it started spilling over into their everyday lives. They were blessed. They were happy. They were on fire for Jesus. They were so happy that they went home happy, and everything they did, including eating God and having the goodwill of all the people. Are we starting to see the difference between the first church and the modern church? Maybe just a smidge. We've lost our excitement. We've lost our jazz-uppedness. Is that a word? Jazz-uppedness. We've lost our fire. We've lost our joy. Now this happens sometimes, it's true, when something becomes such a routine part of our lives that it kind of blends into the scenery and we don't really see it anymore. It happens in marriages, it happens in friendships, it happens with careers, and it happens in our churches. Church becomes such a part of our lives that we start to take it for granted, even if we don't mean to. We glance at the kitchen wall calendar and think, wow, tomorrow's Sunday again, huh? Better set the alarm so I wake up in time for church. And you go. And you might even enjoy it. You might get something from the sermon. I hope you do. But does it excite us to the point that we run out of here so full of joy and happiness and love and praises to God that everyone around us goes, wow, I really like those FBC people. They're always so happy and positive. Maybe. Maybe not. I think it's time for us to reconsider our church, ourselves, our spiritual lives, and our place within the body of Christ. I think it's time for us to tap into the legacy of excitement and joy that our sisters and brothers in the first century had. And we need to do that by connecting into the world around us. What new spiritual and political movements are at work today? We would probably all come up with different answers if we took some time to think about it. I can tell you what I see. I see a generation that is coming of age now that doesn't give a rat's patootie about denominational labels like Methodist or Baptist or Presbyterian, or even broader labels like evangelical. They don't see themselves as members of any one denomination. They see themselves as followers of Jesus. And they don't care about church committees or subcommittees or panels or task forces or whatever else we come up with. And they don't care about church governance or what color the new carpet in the narthex should be. What they do care about is social justice. Even those who aren't practicing Christians care about defending the marginalized. They care about climate change and about being good stewards of the earth. They care about helping those in need. So what better way to reach the young people who aren't Christians but are doing the work that Jesus taught us to do than to go to them and say, hey, this is what we're doing, you want to give us a hand? The church where I was a student pastor was always saying they wanted growth, they wanted new members, they wanted young families. Really, really good people. They had the best of intentions. They just didn't want to do anything different the way they'd always done it. And one Sunday, a young married couple showed up to worship. And after the service, the regular members made a point of talking to them, which is great, that's what you want. But they talked about the church history, the adult Sunday school class, and I kid you not, the offering envelopes. And when the couple didn't come back after a few weeks, I called them. And they said, oh, your church is nice, but we decided to join the church down the street. They have a food bank ministry, and we really want to be involved in giving back. That's the movement that's stirring in our country right now, at least it's one of them. So if we want to ignite the passion in our hearts for the work of Jesus on earth, we need to open our eyes and open our doors and get out there and join it. Now, I just want to say right here that I am absolutely not disparaging this congregation. The work this congregation does for ministry and outreach is amazing. It's one of the main things that drew me to you and convinced me to accept your call. And I can see some session people out here, so I'm just going to say I'm also not disparaging church boards, the Sunday school classes, and new carpeting. Those things are important in the life of the church, but they're not enough to keep life in the church. If we want to keep life in our churches, if we want to see our numbers grow, if we want to be the kind of people that make the world outside outside our doors say, wow, those people are awesome. Look how much they care about us. Look how much they love Jesus. Then we have to reignite ourselves. We have to find new ways to flourish as Christians. We have to find new things to get excited about. What we do here at church is important. Gathering as a body, worshiping together, taking communion together, having meetings, praying together, all of that is important. But if we want our church to grow and thrive, we have to stop thinking of ourselves as the end user. All of this, is not for us. We don't come to church to be entertained. Keith and I, and the choir, and David, and the organists, we're not up here to be entertainers. We're up here to lead us all in worship. We're in church to worship God. We're in church to bring our thanks and praise to God. I used to not get that. I would go home after church, and if the sermon was dull or we didn't sing any of my favorite hymns, I'd feel incredibly cheated. I complained to anyone who would listen that I just hadn't gotten anything out of church that day. And it wasn't until much later in my life that I realized what a selfish attitude that is. Church didn't owe it to me to keep me entertained for an hour. The purpose of church is to worship God. We come to church to worship God, and when we go out into the world, we need to continue to worship God. Everything we do, everything we say, every step we take is to be for the glory of God. And that's how people will follow us back to church. Now let's go back to Acts 2, the very last part of verse 47. And day by day the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. So the growth of their numbers was the effect of the good things that people were doing, not the cause. They didn't start doing all these good things because there were new people joining their numbers. People were joining their numbers because of the good things they were doing. Now we can follow this church growth, this expansion of the Christian movement all the way through the New Testament. Remember, Jesus only shows up in the 4 Gospels. After that, it's the 12 disciples turned apostles out there doing the work. And it went on from there through generation after generation of Christian believers who devoted themselves to doing the work of Jesus out in the world and gathering together regularly to worship God. And that's how the church grew. Apostles everywhere continued to spread the gospel of Jesus and living what they had been taught by the apostles who came before them. The Apostle Paul started an estimated 14 churches, either directly or indirectly, because some of them, like the church of Ephesus, for example, branched out into several other churches. But wherever he went, Paul devoted himself to spreading the gospel of Jesus. And Paul was also aware of the spiritual and political movements around him, and he used his ministry to address those. In a lot of ways, I consider Paul to be the first Christian apologist or defender of the faith because of the way he took stock of what was going on around him and then used that in the way he approached the people. Further on in the book of Acts, chapter 17, verses 16 through 34, we see Paul at what, in my opinion, is his absolute best. He's in Athens, where he's been taken because he was causing all kinds of ruckus in Thessalonica and Berea in northern Greece. So his people took him to Athens, where he would be safe. So he's in Athens, just hanging out, waiting for his friends Silas and Timothy to get there. And while he's waiting, Paul starts to look around at Athens. And what he sees are idols everywhere. They're like Screw's coffee shops. They're just everywhere you look. Everywhere he looked were pagan idols that were used for worship. Now, Paul, as you might expect, didn't like that. So he went to the synagogue and he began to preach about Jesus. Now, the Greeks, as you might expect, didn't like that. So they took him to a meeting at the Areopagus and asked him to explain himself. This was a pivotal moment for Christianity. Athens was a pagan city. They knew nothing about Christianity. Remember, the Christian Christian movement started over by Syria. Athens was almost 800 miles away. Syria is down here, and Athens is all the way over here, on the other side of the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea. In the days before cars and planes and the internet, as Grandpa Sam would have said, that was a firm peace. So the Greeks had not been exposed to the Christian movement, so to this guy Jesus that Paul kept talking about. So they could have branded Paul a lunatic or a criminal and gotten rid of him. Paul knew this. So when he preached his sermon at the Areopagus, he spoke to them on their level. He spoke to them in a way that they would understand. If you haven't read this sermon lately, go back and read it again. It is phenomenal. Paul explained that he'd been walking around Athens, and he looked at their various objects of worship, and he found an altar with an inscription that said, "To an unknown God." So he let himself get a real feel for what was important to the Greeks, what they believed. And in his sermon, he quoted Greek philosophers, he quoted Greek poets. You see the genius there? He caught their attention by talking about things that they understood, things that mattered to them. And then he went on to tell them about God and God's relationship to humanity and how silly it was to be worshiping idols and an unknown God when they could be worshiping a God they would very much be able to know because of this guy Jesus, the Son of God. And Paul dropped the mic. And people in Athens began to follow Paul and became Christian converts. And long story short, that's why the New Testament was originally written in Greek for the Greeks. And it continued to happen. Many of the different translations of the Bible that are out there were produced so that those who would read them would understand its words. In the 9th century, the Saxons were being forced to convert to Christianity, and although they submitted to baptism because they were literally forced to, they were completely ambivalent about Christianity itself. And a version of the gospel called the Helion was written in Old Saxon and used the words that the rough and tumble Saxons would have used in their everyday conversations. In the late 19th century, women's suffragette Elizabeth Cady Stanton published the Women's Bible. I have a copy in my office, much to Keith's chagrin. You can borrow it if you want. Okay? And within the last few years, a Jamaican version of the Bible came out that tells the Word of God in Creole and refers to the disciples as Jesus boys. And that's just 3 examples. Even the Message, which has become a popular translation of the Bible in recent years, puts God's Word into our modern language. People need to be able to fit themselves into the stories of Jesus so it feels relevant to them. Every culture has its own artistic depictions of Jesus and the disciples as well. And they're all correct, because Jesus is in all of us. We are all made in the image of God. That's how the church grows, by reaching out to the world around us, whatever society we're living in, and whatever language it speaks, literally or culturally. We're telling the people in it that they matter to us because they matter to God. While my attempts to relate to the gathered family of the Kitty Rogers fans' funeral in Pennsylvania failed big time, much more often our attempts to bring the love of God and the gospel of Jesus to those around us in a way they will understand will not fail. That's how our church has grown. When First Presbyterian Church in Hutchinson, Kansas started 150 years ago this year, it looked very different. Kansas was a little more at that time than a grassy prairie. And 16 people began their life together as a congregation that became First United Presbyterian Church of Hutchinson. And then children of the original members, along with others who joined, continued to serve faithfully, and the church continued to grow. But as Reverend Jim Brock, who became pastor of this congregation in 1966, wrote in the church's centennial publication, which will also be in the archives after worship, it became a great church in no small part because the lives of the city and the church are so intertwined. As we end our time here together this morning, I'd like to read you a bit of what Reverend Brock wrote in this centennial publication, which was generously gifted to us just this past week by longtime church member Mary Klein. This publication came out in 1972 as the church celebrated its 100th anniversary. These are Reverend Brock's words. This second century is a new beginning. At a very fast rate, we are moving into the future. We cannot anticipate what the church will be in the years ahead. Just as our fathers before us were anxious to do their master's will in their time, so we are in ours. Whatever the character of the ministry of First United Presbyterian Church in the next 100 years, we are convinced that our future is one also of challenge and achievement. We give thanks, O Lord, for the past